everybody here and those online. Today, Namrata is going to take us through a new topic for us, not new, relatively new topic for us, but an old concept of Bayesian methodology in a randomized control study. So that's new for us. Dr. Jesilan used to teach us Bayesian diagnostic study, but Bayesian RCT is a little bit new. So Namrata will explain the principles of Bayes, and then we'll go through Bayes in this particular study which he's going to use. Just as an introduction, there are just two foundational ideas in Bayes. First is that we are reallocating probabilities. So whenever we say that 80% chance of something happening, it's a probability. We're not 100% sure of anything. So we always have some probability. And then when we have some new information about whatever we are studying, then we rethink the original probability and reallocate that probability. Anyway, Namrata will explain that. So the probability of what? It could be the mean of a value, it could be a relative risk, it could be an odds ratio. So we are reallocating the probability of some value, some parameter value. So again, what that value is, Namrata will explain. So these are the two main things. There are many other stories. People say Sherlock Holmes used to be a Bayesian man. He'll have 4 possible criminals. He will collect evidence about each criminal, and then one by one he'll eliminate one criminal and reallocate the probability to other criminals till finally he comes to one. And in one story he says, even if that is the most improbable person, if I ruled out everybody else, he is the person. I mean, I'm paraphrasing Sherlock Holmes. So anyway, with that silly introduction, we'll hand over to Namrata.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. I'm Namrata. I am touching today upon the Bayes theorem and its application in a randomized control trial. Like sir told us, there are two major schools of thought. So the traditional school of thought is a frequentist approach. Frequentist means you ask a question and you do a study, and only from the results of that study you make your inference. At the beginning of the study, you generate a null hypothesis, which means there is no difference between the intervention and the control. And then you generate something called a p-value to see whether what is the chance that you get a result so extreme that your null hypothesis has to be rejected. This is the frequentist approach. But in around 1800s, this priest called Reverend Bayes, he actually thought, I know how prevalent a disease already is. Instead of knowing how common a test can be positive in a disease, more important is for me to know whether if I test positive, what is the chance that I have a disease, correct? As a person, I am not bothered whether mammogram rate of detection of breast cancer is 99%. I want to know if I have a positive mammogram, what is the chance of me having breast cancer? So he flipped the question, basically. He was looking at what is the chance that I have a disease if I have a positive test. This is the way of thinking. This is how the Bayes theorem approaches a question. Knowing that you already have some information, what is the chance that that disease is positive in you? So actually, the important thing when we ask this sort of question is to actually, the basis is how prevalent the disease is. Then the next step is how good is the test? How good is the test in detection of the disease? And together we come to a probability of whether if I test positive, do I have the disease or not? So basically, to put it very simply, the prior information that we have on the disease is the prevalence of the disease. It combines it with the knowledge on the sensitivity of the test, which you do in your study. And then you generate the posterior, which is what is the probability if I have breast cancer if my mammogram is positive. So this is, yes. Yes, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that's in a diagnostic study. We're doing an RCT. This can be applied to anything. But that's only for diagnosis.
Correct.
We'll repeat that.
Correct. Dr. Georgie had asked whether the principle of this is the same as the Fagan's nomogram. I will come to it. I have a slide on the Fagan's nomogram. So basically the idea is you have some information, you study some information, and you generate final hypothesis based on both of these things. So this is the Bayes theorem. So the probability of A given B is A/B is the probability of B given A into the probability of A, that is the prior information that you have, divided by the probability of B. Now all this can be mathematically derived. I will come to a simple mathematical example, but this is a derivation from the law of total and conditional probability. So I will not get into how this theorem was derived because it is beyond our scope for today. So the example is, now we have 100 people in a fair, okay? And you already know that this fellow has one rare disease. So, and you have a test to detect this disease. Now this disease is 99%, this test is 99% sensitive and 99% specific, which means 99% of the time it will correctly identify a sick person and 99% of the time it will correctly reject a healthy person, correct? Now, suppose one of these 100 people took the test and tested positive. What is the chance that he actually has the disease? This is the question that Bayes asks. What is the chance that I have the disease if I test positive? Now, presuming that we test this red fellow, he will have 99% chance that the disease is actually detected. But when we test the 99 healthy people, other than this person, we already know this person is sick. We test the 99 healthy people, say this person. What is the chance that he will test positive? So in 100 people, the test can correctly rule out 99 people. But there is still a 1% chance that he might test positive, right? So approximating for 99 people, for 100 people, 1% might test positive. So approximating that for 100 people, maybe one will test positive who's actually healthy. Okay. Now I have two test positives. So intuitively, what is the chance that I have a disease if I have a test positive? Two people tested positive, you know one has disease. So 50% of the people who test positive actually have the disease. This is very counterintuitive to our thinking, right? Because we have a 99% specific test and a 99% sensitive test. But when I apply it on the individual level, it is only 50% it is able to detect whether I have disease or not. Now we will see the math of this. The reason why this test in quote unquote underperformed is because the disease is very rare. So the important thing here is the goodness of a test is dependent on the prevalence in the population, which is an extension of what the Bayes theorem is actually telling us. What you generate from the posterior is dependent on the prior and on the likelihood. Now I will just do the math for our question. I have it written down here for ease of calculation. So okay. Okay, so this is what Bayes theorem states. Sorry, yeah. Okay, now this is the Bayes theorem. Now what we were looking is, what is the probability that I am sick if I test positive? What is the probability that I test positive if I'm actually sick? Divide into the probability that I am sick divided by the probability that I test positive. Okay. Now, let us take this first. So this is easy, right? This is the prevalence of the disease in the population. Okay. So we will substitute this by just 0.01. Okay. Now, Next, we will do what is the probability that I test positive if I am actually sick. So that is the sensitivity of the test. Okay, so that is 99%. Okay, now this value, the probability of me testing positive on the whole, this needs to be derived. Okay, so now I can test, this is also a rule of probability. I can test positive either if I am, sorry, one second. Okay, I can be positive in two scenarios. I am positive and I am sick, or I am positive and I am healthy, not sick. Okay. Now, the probability of being positive and sick is the probability of being positive, which is 0.99. And the probability of not being sick is 0.99 into probability of being positive in that population. So this whole thing comes to 0.0198. Now, if you divide these two, you actually get 0.5, which is what our test actually showed us. From our intuition, we said that if two people are tested, one will be sick and one will not be sick. And even if you substitute it mathematically in the Bayes theorem with your physical values of sensitivity, prevalence of, this is the only thing that has to be derived basically, with your physical values of sensitivity and prevalence in the population, you will actually get the same value. You will get 0.5. Okay. Now, this is what I was saying, that you have the same accuracy or sensitivity of the test, but the performance of the test actually depends on the base rate or prevalence of the disease. So if you have a less prevalent disease, the chance that you will actually be positive if you have you'll be disease positive if you have a test positive is only 50%. The same thing, if you had increased this 1% to 30%, the calculation actually comes to 97%. So real world examples of using the Bayes theorem are many. For example, it is not only used in clinical science, it is used in spam filtering. So if mails contain things like free, promotion, brand, these kind of things, automatically Gmail is able to mark it as spam, right? That is from machine learning. What is the probability that this is spam if these words are there in the mail? Similarly, like that, weather forecasting. If I have a depression on Bay of Bengal, what is the chance that it will rain in Chennai today and in Vellore tomorrow? DNA testing, financial forecasting, drug testing, and Fagan's nomogram. So Fagan's nomogram is basically tells you the pre-test and the post-test probability, and you have the likelihood ratio for the test being positive. So if you have a high prior probability, then for the same likelihood ratio, you will have a higher posterior probability. If you have a low prior probability, then you will have a consequently low post-test probability. So this is one lady called Sharon Burns McGain, who was very interested in the Bayes theorem and wrote a book about it. So she said that Bayes rule can be described in one sentence. By updating our initial beliefs with objective new information, we get a new and improved belief. To its adherents, it's an elegant statement about learning from experience. To its opponents, it is subjectivity run amok. So this is the main criticism of the Bayes theorem. The Bayes theorem, everyone says that we don't know how good the prior information was. So the people who criticize Bayes theorem says that we should not be using anything from before. What we do is what we know. We don't know what the quality of the prior is. Now I'm just coming to some words that are often used in Bayesian analysis. These are just like how we understand p-value and confidence interval, and these are just words that are used in any Bayesian analysis which we should be familiar with. So the first thing is, the important concept to note is Bayes is never the result of Bayes analysis is never expressed as a single number. It is always expressed as a probability distribution. So the prior likelihood and posterior are represented as mathematically as probability density functions or distributions, where there is a range. So, for example, this is the mortality of at 1 year follow-up. If you were using a normal frequentist approach, you will say that the mortality is 30%. But in a Bayesian analysis, you have to say the mortality can vary anywhere from 15% to 45%. Okay. Now, priors, so prior is what information you have about the disease prior to doing your study. So priors are of many types. They can be based on the treatment effect. They can be pessimistic, neutral, or optimistic. Okay. So if I am doing a trial on mammogram in breast cancer, in detecting breast cancer, there might be trials which say mammogram is very good in detecting breast cancer. There might be trials which say mammogram performs badly in young women in detecting breast cancer. So pessimistic trial, neutral trial, and optimistic trial. Now, there are also types of priors based on the strength of belief. So there are flat priors, uninformative priors, and informative priors. Basically, the idea of this is that the more information you have, the steeper your curve becomes, and the more well-defined, the closer to the central tendency the curve becomes. It's the same as a Gaussian distribution. The more data you have, the bigger your sample size, the more well-defined your population, and the less heterogeneity there is in your population, your ability to make a single prediction becomes much more than a range of predictions. Now, what is likelihood? In the context of Bayes analysis, the likelihood refers to how likely we would be to get our trial outcomes if the hypothesis described by the prior distribution was correct. Basically, likelihood is what we find from our current analysis. Posterior is when you combine the prior probability distribution and the likelihood probability distribution. These two curves will generate a new curve called the posterior probability distribution. So while combining prior and likelihood, you have to weight it in the sense you have to weight how much the prior can contribute to the final posterior, depending on what the population is, how well the study was done, what is the sample size of that study. Yep. So this is just a diagrammatic representation. So the green is the prior. Okay. So this is like an uninformative prior, which means it's a sort of flat curve. Blue is your likelihood. That remains the same. Okay. The study that you're doing is the likelihood that remains the same. The only thing that has changed here is the prior. From here to here, this uninformative prior has become more informative. And we can see how much sharper the posterior curve has become because of the quality of the prior. Does anyone have any doubts at this point? Okay. Now, we are coming to some more terms that are used in Bayesian analysis. So, the central tendency is similar to a Gaussian distribution. We use mean or median, you can use. For skewed distributions, we prefer median over mean because mean is affected by outliers. Here, we don't have confidence intervals. We have credible intervals. So, it is an analog of the confidence interval, but it is not the same. I'll come to it. So this curve represents the last 2.5% of the outliers on either side are removed, and you have a 95% credible interval, not a confidence interval. So, you know, very often in confidence interval, we say that there is a 95% chance that the value lies in between that. Actually, what we're describing there is a credible interval, because the probability that something lies in a range is the principle of Bayesian analysis. When we get a p-value and confidence interval, the confidence interval of say minus 0.1 to plus 0.1 doesn't mean that 95% of the time the true value lies in between that, right? So the true parameter, the parameter that you detect, the result is fixed in a frequentist approach. The confidence interval in a frequentist approach says that if I repeat this test 100 times, 95 of the times the true value will lie between the ranges that I get these 100 times. So, but however, in a credible interval, 95% of the time, the true parameter lies within the credible interval that you have described. So we don't know what the true parameter is until the posterior is generated. You only know the interval. Now, probability of effect. So the effect size or the effect rather in a Bayesian analysis can be described as odds ratio, log odds ratio, absolute risk reduction, relative risk reduction. One important thing in Bayesian analysis is it allows you to pre-specify what is a clinically significant difference. That I'll come to it. In very often in frequentist studies, when we get a statistically significant p-value less than 0.05, sometimes it might not be clinically significant, right? Blood pressure reduction of 3 millimeter mercury in giving new antihypertensive might not make clinical meaning to a patient, but it might be statistically significant. But Bayes' theorem allows you to define both of these things, in the sense you can decide whether that probability value is significant, and you can decide whether that makes clinical sense or not. So I have some badly drawn diagrams here. So basically this is probability direction. Probability direction is it is not the size of the treatment effect. It just tells you, is there a treatment effect or not? Okay. So it does not even tell you the clinical significance of this effect. So if it ranges between 0 and 100%. So if I have, say, PD 95%, that is a probability direction of 95%. It tells me that 95% of the time, the 95% of the effect is on one side of null value. Similarly, if I have PD of 5%, it says 5% of the time, the effect is on one side of the null value. That's all. It doesn't tell you how important this effect is. For example, okay. That's it. Okay. Okay. So if I had a good or a strong clinically significant treatment effect, I might have a narrow curve, but I can still have 95% of the curve on this side with a probability distribution like this, correct? Or I can have 95% with a probability distribution like this. Both are 95% on one side of the curve, correct? But it doesn't tell you so it only tells you there is some direction towards which the whole thing is moving. It doesn't tell you how good that is or whether it is clinically significant. Okay. Now, probability of clinical significance is indicated by two things: region of practical equivalence, which is a predefined value, and minimal clinically important difference. So these are things that you arbitrarily set before you start your RCT. So you have to say that, below 1.05 onwards, I will have some so finally, when you generate the posterior, you have to decide whether above this is clinically significant or not. So you will say mild benefit and outstanding benefit, I am going to take as minimal clinical difference. Whereas anything below mild benefit, I will not. So you have to define what is clinical benefit prior to your study. And once you generate your posterior curve, you should decide at the number above which everything is clinically significant. Below, so so here the rope is given, the region of practical equivalence is everything below 1.05. Everything which is mild and outstanding benefit is considered clinically significant. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch about before we go on to our RCT is the choice of the prior in a sensitivity analysis and sensitivity analysis. So basically, when you choose a prior, you have to say why you're choosing this prior. We'll come to it in our study, but why are you choosing this prior? Is this population similar to my population? What were the questions asked in that study? Ideally, when you do a study using Bayesian analysis, if the prior is influencing your posterior a lot, that means either your study has gone wrong or your prior selection has gone wrong. Because finally, the biggest change in your posterior should come from your likelihood, not from your prior. And when you choose your priors, you have to choose an informed prior, in the sense a good RCT with a clearly defined population and a clearly defined outcome. When multiple priors are used, you can do sensitivity analysis. Yes.
For the likelihood, you mentioned that the posterior should be influenced more by the likelihood than the prior. So yes, prior selection is very important. But the likelihood, is that fixed, or it's like a parametric value in the overall sense? Is the likelihood what we have discovered so far by priors? Okay. Okay. So the likelihood is being generated by the current study that we are going to do. Oh. Okay. Okay. That was a good. Thanks.
Okay. So, corollary to this is that the more significant your data, the better your sample size, the more clear your inclusion exclusion, then the less chance that random priors will influence your posterior. Okay. Now, this is just a summary of everything that I've said. It is a busy slide, so I just want to focus on what I've highlighted in the red boxes. So basically, in frequentist, you just ask what is the expected frequency of an event. But in Bayesian, you say what is the probability that my hypothesis is true. The primary question is, what is the chance that I get data this extreme if the null hypothesis is true in a frequentist approach? Whereas in a Bayesian approach, what is the probability that this observed data is true? That's all. There is no null hypothesis. So obviously, these differences with regards to the inferences from each are there, like p-value versus the posterior probability, confidence interval versus credible interval. What is significant in Bayes? That is decided by the investigator. There is no single value of the posterior probability that is significant. Yeah. The prior. Regular after making a previous study, calculate the sample. So how that also you are taking a prior study result to generate your result. But sorry, Dr. Anna's question is that in a frequentist approach, we make use of information from the previously done study to calculate our sample size, right? But in the Bayes theorem, I mean the Bayesian approach, the population data from the prior is used in generating the posterior. So I will actually take patients from an RCT from before, and I will analyze them along with the patients that I have done in my RCT and generate a new curve. So, yeah. And then, sorry, what was I coming to? Yeah, so predefined, so p-value. So there is no defined no defined statistic that is significant for a Bayesian analysis. I can say that I want 90% of the people that I'm doing the study on to be benefited. Whereas if my intervention, that depends on the intervention, it depends on the cost of the intervention, it depends on the adverse effects associated with the intervention. We'll come to this more when we are appraising the trial. But basically, the investigator decides based on the population and based on the intervention whether this is significant or not. Only thing is, before you start the study, you have to mention what you think will be a clinically meaningful difference. And there is no consideration given to prior information. Other than calculating sample size, there is no consideration given to prior information in the frequentist approach, whereas that is not the case in a Bayes approach. So the strengths of a Bayes approach are, it allows you to ask clinically significant questions. It allows you to ask a clinically meaningful question for an individual. What is the chance that I have disease if this test is positive, right? Rather than what is the chance that this test is positive for 100 people with breast cancer. And a range of priors can be interrogated, chosen, and reported in the Bayes analysis. Whereas the limitations is, it requires advanced statistical softwares to compute, and the quality of priors can influence your study if your likelihood is not very strong. And the subjective nature is criticized by some. Now, I just put up this slide because this was a very talked about study. This is the EOLIA study, EOLIA, for ECMO in severe ARDS. So firstly, when this came out in NEJM in 2018, actually the frequentist approach said it is not significant. But then there was this group, Golliger et al. Actually went back and looked at a lot of ECMO studies, generated priors. They generated lots of priors, from neutral priors to pessimistic priors to optimistic priors. And then they applied all of that with the likelihood of this study. And they actually found that with using optimistic priors, there was 40% of people had betterment in mortality, as in a decreased mortality with ECMO in severe ARDS. So there is some justification for using an invasive, costly method in a very sick person if you have a 40% mortality decrease. This is just the US FDA has actually put up some guidelines for using Bayesian methods in clinical trials. So there is a document that can be downloaded. There is also a podcast called Bayesian Statistics for Clinicians Who Don't Like Math. That is by JAMA. It is very good. Like, it is without going into too much probability, how you can use how you can understand rather Bayesian statistics. Okay, so now we'll come to analysis of the randomized control trial. So this is my case scenario. There's a 60-year-old gentleman, a farmer from Gudiyatham, who came with fever and dysuria for 2 days, breathlessness for 6 hours, and giddiness for 1 hour. On arrival to the ED, he is tachycardic, tachypneic, hypotensive, peripheries are warm, bilateral crepitations suggestive of ARDS, left renal angle tenderness suggestive of a pyelonephritis. ABG shows metabolic acidosis with a pH of 7.2, lactate of 8. He is resuscitated with fluid, started on inotropes, intubated and mechanically ventilated. Blood culture has shown growth of pan-sensitive E. coli after 6 hours. Now there is this therapy called polymyxin hemoabsorption, which I will come to. So will I offer this therapy to this man who is very sick and in ICU? Okay, so to look at that, I'm looking at polymyxin B hemoabsorption in endotoxic septic shock. It is a multi-center, open-label, Bayesian randomized clinical trial. That is a phase 3 trial that was published in Lancet Respiratory Medicine a couple of months back. So what is the background of this? So polymyxin is an antibiotic that disrupts the cell wall of gram-negative bacteria. So there is a purification technique called hemoabsorption, in which they embed this cartridge that contains polymyxin. And they are trying to filter blood of people with septic shock and remove endotoxin, circulating endotoxin. So endotoxin is a trigger for systemic inflammatory response. It's a component of the gram-negative bacterial cell membrane. So they are trying to filter out endotoxin in patients with sepsis so that they heal faster. So this has been an ongoing debate from the 1990s. People have been doing trials about polymyxin B hemoabsorption. So there is a trial called Euphrates. There is a trial called J-Septic in Japan. These are all very large trials. EUPHAS in Italy, Abdomix in France. All of these use frequentist approach and found no clinically meaningful benefit in polymyxin B hemoabsorption in people with severe sepsis. Okay, now I'm using CASP to appraise this study. So section A says, is the basic study design valid for an RCT? So did the study address a clearly formulated research question? Yes, the PICO was adults with septic shock needing vasopressors with MODS with endotoxin activity. So they have an endotoxin analysis assay. So they felt that between 0.60 and 0.89 is what is clinically meaningful. This number was generated because they did Bayesian sensitivity analysis on all the people who did these prior trials and found out that the people who are very sick don't benefit. Once the endotoxemia is very high in the blood, they probably will not benefit from this hemoabsorption technique. So it's not detectable by the test, by the assay. Very high values might not be, that post-zone phenomenon might happen where it might not be detectable. In Intervention is polymyxin B hemoabsorption, and the name of the cartridge is toramyxin. Control is standard of care based on sepsis, surviving sepsis guidelines. Outcome is mortality of at 28 days, and the timeline they looked at was 28 days for primary outcome. So was the assignment of participants to the intervention randomized? So it was randomized 2:1 by web-based randomization system, block randomization stratified by site, and allocation was concealed. Were all participants who entered the study accounted for at the conclusion? So there was, so basically the problem here is they have, not a problem, but the fact here is that they have combined this Tigris along with Euphrates, right? So this is Tigris's consort. So they screened 14,890 patients. 328 they met clinical eligibility. 171 were excluded. Okay, either very low endotoxin activity or very high endotoxin activity. Both are excluded. And 157 are randomly assigned. Now, 106, so it is 2:1, right? So 106 and 51. The only thing here is in Euphrates, they did 1:1. They took 90 and 89. I wasn't sure whether they haven't mentioned whether this affects prognostic balance in the supplementary text. So I don't know why they didn't take 2:1 for Euphrates also, because they matched everything to Euphrates. The inclusion and exclusion criteria was exactly the same as Euphrates. The population was North American population. Centers were tertiary care ICUs. As much as possible, they matched everything. Yeah, so finally they did an intention to treat analysis. 196 analyzed here, 140 analyzed here. But actually in the Euphrates trial, one person was lost to follow-up in the intervention arm. Whether they took that person in that 90, I don't know. It is not mentioned. So intention to treat analysis was done, no exclusion after randomization, but one person was lost to follow-up in the Euphrates arm, and follow-up was completed for at 28 days and secondary outcome of mortality at 90 days for all patients. Now section B is the study methodologically sound. Were all participants blind to the intervention? They did not blind in this study. But of note, the outcome is mortality. And these people are all ICU people. They cannot do anything to themselves to decrease mortality also. So probably it is okay to not blind the participants. Were the investigators blinded? They were also not blinded. Only the outcome assessors were blinded, and the outcome is an objective outcome also. Were the study groups similar at the start of the randomized control trial? So yes, they were. This is the baseline characteristics, and they have nicely given it for both the Tigris cohort as well as the Euphrates cohort. The only question I had was this gram-positive bacteremia, why did they take? Because the gram-positive organisms don't produce endotoxin. But then there is some theoretical concept when this thing was conceived that when you have gram-positive septicemia, your gut becomes leaky, and the gram-negatives from your gut will also spill into the blood, and endotoxemia can still occur in a gram-positive sepsis. So probably this was okay to do. Other than that, they had a good set of baseline characteristics which looked at the population characteristics, the level of sickness. So Apache is a ICU mortality prediction score which has a lot of parameters that are of clinical importance in deciding how sick a patient is. MODS, SOFA score, the type of organism, vasopressors. Anyway, ventilation is included in Apache 2 to some extent. So that is fine. Yeah.
You mentioned almost 40% so 70% are term growth.
Correct.
Gram-positive or negative.
Correct.
That's normal.
No.
They have taken very sick patients. So that Georgie's question.
Yeah. So Dr. Georgie's question was that in this study, actually about 40 people, 40% of the people only did not have growth. But so maybe 60% of people actually had growth in blood culture, which is a pretty large estimate considering many of our blood cultures are only 20% of the time positive.
Much less, 10 to 15%. But they have taken a very sick cohort. That's the problem reason why they got it. Because it's also 15 to 20%. Among that, they have taken the most sick people.
One more thing is their time to randomization was very fast, sir. Like within 3 hours, they were randomized. So probably they have not been treated anywhere else. Apart from experimental intervention, did each study group receive the same level of care? That is, are they treated equally? So, the people who receive polymyxin B henoabsorption have one extra central line or dialysis catheter. They are getting polymyxin B. They are getting heparin extra because the blood will clot in the circuit. So, on the whole, they had much more intervention than the control arm. Yeah. One more thing was Euphrates actually followed up their patients more closely in that 28-day period. Now, randomization and methodology is fairly good. So we will come to looking at the results. So the results were the effects of the intervention reported comprehensively. So I thought, yes, was a power calculation undertaken. So they looked at 80% of the power they considered an 80% power with a prior baseline risk of 48% difference in mortality, which was a pretty big difference that they looked at. So they have not mentioned which paper exactly has yielded this 48% difference, because everything did not have clinical benefit, but yes, did not show clinically meaningful benefits. But then not all of them were mortality endpoints. Some of them were SOFA score changing. Some of them were only in peritonitis patients. This is a very heterogeneous cohort. Absolute risk reduction of 13.5% would need at least 150 patients in the TIGRIS cohort to show 95% posterior probability. By a rule of thumb, sorry, sir. By rule of thumb, above 90% posterior probability is pretty good. But they have said that they want 95% and above posterior probability to think that it is clinically meaningful.
Suppose we were to do a frequentist approach here, how much would have been the sample size? Did we do that exercise?
50%. 70.
The frequentist approach is cheaper than Bayesian analysis, easier.
50% reduction. That sample size is an RCT we come to.
13%.
Understood. Suppose we want to do a absolute risk reduction of 14% mortality, what would be the normal? That's for on the Bayesian analysis. This is the frequentist step. Okay. Oh, okay.
Absolute risk reduction is 13.5. So it will come down to 35%.
Yeah.
48 to 35. With that sample size in a frequentist, the 150 is this question.
So this is the frequentist or Bayesian?
Frequentist.
Okay.
We'll have to count and check that's correct.
So this is free. From what I understood from the paper was they looked at power and what they had prior and generated a sample size, which is like the frequentist approach. And they have enrolled 150 patients, 150 plus patients. Okay, yeah, we are rechecking the sample size, whether this was done by frequentist approach or not.
Yeah.
Can we do this Bayesian analysis for calculating sample size?
Yes. So 48% in the control arm and 48 minus 13 is
34,
35.
35, 34, 35.
And 80% power. Two-sided donor. 220 toward the at 80%.
At 80%. Yes.
This is a Bayesian use.
So sample size calculated actually by frequentist approach should come to 220, but here they have 150. What outcomes were measured and what were they clearly specified? 28-day mortality was the primary outcome. And how were results expressed? They were expressed as probability distributions of posterior. 28 and 90-day mortality was also put in as a Kaplan-Meier curve. So were results reported for each outcome in each study group? Yes. Were there any missing and incomplete data? Largely no. Were there any differential dropout? No. Was there potential sources of bias identified? So they have not mentioned bias in the study at all. But I assume that because randomization and allocation was done both well in both trials, and our outcome was objective, then probably there was not a lot of bias at the selection level. And objective was outcome was also objective, so blinding didn't matter. Which statistical test was used? So basically, they weighted this Euphrates as 75%. There was some, they've said they have discounted the results by 25% for Euphrates because if, in Tigris, some of them were also smaller centers. Not everything was tertiary hospital. And then they did a Bayesian sensitivity analysis on this. And what p-values reported, p-values are not applicable here. So this is the results. So basically, this is the primary outcome. We are looking at 28-day mortality, intention to treat. Between, we are looking at the adjusted odds ratio. Odds ratio was adjusted for Apache score and the posterior probability of benefit. So this will come as a curve in the next slide, but this is the value of the median value of the curve, the credibility interval for the curve, and the posterior probability of benefit. So we can see here that there is a, so how we read this is there is a 95% chance that heme absorption decreases mortality at 28 days. There is a, so other, you can also say that in 20%, if you have 20 patients, 19 patients will actually have less mortality. Yes, will have less mortality at 28 days. So the 95% credibility interval actually means that the true odds ratio can lie anywhere between 0.39 to 1.08. 1 means no benefit. So a large majority of the people are trending towards benefit. And there is a small proportion which might not benefit. Same thing in the form of probability curves. So basically, this is for 28-day mortality and this is a 90-day mortality. So the prior from Euphrates is blue, the likelihood from Tigris is green, and the posterior that is generated from these two are orange. So this says that the odds ratio, adjusted odds ratio comes to about 0.67, which will be the median value of this curve.
95% value.
Yeah, 95% of the values are towards benefit or decreased mortality. This is Kaplan-Meier. So they have, basically there is a separation of the curves at around 28 days and there is benefit that continues all the way down to 90 days. So was the precision of the estimate of the intervention effect reported? Yes. In Bayesian analysis, we look at credibility intervals. So precision was reported. Do the benefits of the experimental intervention outweigh the harms? So I feel like we can't tell from this study because there is a, I'll come to this. So basically there is, what is the size of the intervention is something that we have to consider when we are looking at whether this is significant or not. So there is a 95% chance of anywhere from a 61% decrease in mortality to no decrease in mortality with a median decrease in mortality of 33%. Same thing as the curve said basically. And were the harms or unintended effects reported? So there were significant adverse events that were 8% higher in the polymyxin group. And 2 of them were directly related to the insertion of the catheter. 1 person had bleeding when the dialysis catheter was inserted and 1 person had an anaphylactic shock to polymyxin. So was a cost effectiveness undertaken? Not in this study. So serious adverse events, there was an 8% more adverse event profile in the intervention arm, and 2% of these were actually related to the therapy itself. So cost effectiveness is not done in Tigris, but actually this Japanese study that I was talking about has actually done a cost effective analysis. So they have said that the average medical cost for patients receiving polymyxin B heme adsorption is $34,000. This significantly higher because it's not only the procedure. You know, you need trained people to do this. Someone has to insert the dialysis catheter. You need, if person is on CRRT, then CRRT machine has to be there. They should be in ICU in that period of time. Procedure adds roughly $18,000 to hospital expenses per patient. But despite high expenses, they felt that the ICER was actually on the side of benefit in this Japanese study. Okay, so the last part of CASP is to say whether these results are helpful to us locally. So can these study results be applied to your context? So yes, you can. Like severe sepsis can happen anywhere, and mortality of 28 days is an important outcome. There is one study from India, actually, which is done in New Delhi, which looks at heme adsorption, polymyxin heme adsorption in India. So it was a randomized control trial of 50 ICU patients from Delhi. Of note, these were significantly lower SOFA scores than what was reported in Tigris and all. Like SOFA scores here were 2, 3, 4 and all. Tigris was 17, 18, 20 and all that. The range is 4 to 20. So at day 7, survival rate was not significant. There was no difference in mortality statistically. But they have said that there is some trend towards faster recovery of lactate, ventilator dependence, urine output, SOFA score. But what they have done is they have compared the change from baseline of intervention to 28 days after, 7 days after intervention. And baseline of control versus 7 days after control. No, they're not comparing intervention to control. They're comparing baseline of each to the 7 days of each. So would experimental intervention provide greater value? Depends. I mean, probably in our setting, probably not. Like unless the patient is able to afford this and can take the risk of those side effects happening, can afford another 2-3 days of ICU. Another thing is you require study of endotoxin levels. So I couldn't find out who does endotoxin. I think NephroLab does it. There is a tariff for it. Yeah. Okay.
So the endotoxin is was previously done by that limbless amoebocyte lysate assay, but they have upgraded that assay to another newer generation assay recently, and they do it regularly for our disinfection purposes. Currently, it is being I think it is significantly costly. Each run is about 20 or 30,000 for us, but no, we do 3 samples every two weeks if there is infection, and every 4 weeks if as routine. And if breakthrough happens, we do more frequently. I will check back and get the exact cost. It is costly, and currently it's being billed to the our special fund. I don't know whether they have a service available as this one. So they may be the ones which they can do to do in the blood levels. Currently, it is being done on the dialysate, not in the blood, not for the patient. So it's for the system, not for the patient service.
So, like the tariff rates that that are there in CMC is 4,700 and 8,240. But that ranges all the way to 15,225. I think that depends on what test you are using. So the appraisal summary is that methodology positives were methodology was sound. They tried to match the likelihood cohort as much as they could to the prior. Good follow-up, uniform interventions, important outcome assessors were blinded. They reached the purported sample size, but like after we calculated it, there is probably some discrepancy in the sample size. Study was completed. But there is some skepticism related to choosing of priors for Bayesian analysis. And I didn't understand why they didn't choose multiple priors here. Probably because they wanted to do it only in the North American population. And unknowns are cost and accessibility issues. So back to our case scenario, for my patient, I would not recommend doing this polymyxin B heme adsorption. But that being said, there is a UFAS 2 also that has started to again look at do a post hoc Bayesian analysis of the initial UFAS trial. So I thought like financial feasibility is one. Second, he's come early into sepsis. Hopefully endotoxemia is not very bad. Third, it's a pan-sensitive organism. So I'm hoping that antibiotic itself will work. But if, yeah. No. This is my scenario only.
Georgie's question is, how do you decide? Dr. Georgie's question is, if a person comes with severe septic shock, pan-sensitive, general outcomes are good. Multi-resistant is bad. Just go back to that cost effectiveness slide. So this is a question which somebody asked, how do you decide per quali? So there's a general guideline. India's GDP is some number, but that is from that we can calculate per capita GDP. So generally people say that if, let us say India's per capita GDP is 10,000 rupees, 3,000 rupees. So if you can get one quality adjusted life year for less than 3,000 rupees, we'll consider it very cost effective intervention. But then that's a very high bar, difficult bar. So you multiply that by 3. So let us say 10,000 rupees. If you can get any new intervention to give you one quality adjusted life year for 10,000 rupees, then we'll consider it, health economists will say that is cost effective. Now, in India, no, none of this. I was just trying to convert 11,000 euros will be 11 lakhs. I don't know, it's 11 lakh or 11 crore. Like this into 100 is how much? 11,000 into 100 is 11 lakhs. Let's just put 11,000 into 100. 11 lakhs. So roughly it won't be cost effective. However, it's a US GDP is 30,000 US dollars. Into 3 is 90,000. So in the US, people will say this is a very cost effective intervention. In fact, it's less than 1 per capita GDP. So some people argue, how did you come up with this formula? Some economists said this is the formula. So you have to make a decision before what is cost effective and not. On the other hand, like if a rich person, I should not say this, but if a person who's affordable comes to you in severe septic shock and he says, can you try some other treatment? Then maybe we may decide, okay, we have this treatment, we have the expertise, let's give it a shot. So usually it's never yes or no. It all depends on if I don't have the expertise to put in this catheter and I don't have this, we won't do. If I have it and it's available and the person is rapidly worsening, maybe we can do that.
So take home message is frequentist and Bayesian are two, what can I say? It is like two, it's like yin and yang. Nothing is bad and good. Like it's just two different ways of looking at the same question. And Bayesian thinking conceives probability as a measure of strength of a belief. And with the advent of modern statistical software, this has become much more accessible and possible to do. These are my references. And I would like to acknowledge Dr. Jayasila and Dr. Tambu and Dr. Vignesh for their support as well. Thank you. This is Reverend Thomas Bayes. He actually asked the first question that started Bayes' theorem. He wanted to find out, I forgot what his exact question was. He wanted to find out some sort of hypothesis, but then he thought this was a bad way to do it and he just abandoned it. And he wrote a lot about it and he just left the work. And then a century later, Pierre Laplace actually thought that this can be plugged into math and you can actually find a lot of things with this. And this is Alan Turing. He actually, if anyone has watched Imitation Game, he was the man who solved the World War II German Enigma puzzle using the Bayes' theorem of conditional probability. Thank you.
X-axis in terms of odds ratio or whatever, that this is a null hypothesis value. Do you remember she presented 95.3%? So we were able to generate. Now, say for an example, if you do a study and land up with no significant difference, and say for an example, if the p-value is 0.06 or 0.07, the frequentist approach will say that it is not significant, therefore we are not interested in the study. However, if you are able to generate this distribution, you would be able to say what percentage of subject had a difference of 10%, 4%, 5%, and so on. That is called sensitivity analysis. If for an example here, what percentage of subject had the odds ratio, is that right? This is odds ratio 10, or the mean difference, whatever is. So it says, for an example, if my interest is, if I ask the question, what percentage of subjects had 10% difference between the two arms, it is about 60%. Isn't it very important difference? So that kind of data comes from the posterior analysis. So they were able to show by mixing this to the prior, it was statistically significant. But you can get much more information. This is the posterior curve. It comes from mixing the prior and the posterior, the likelihood. This is your null hypothesis value. This area is 95.3%. So therefore, it is very useful in terms of sensitivity analysis. Any questions?
So even if you do a normal like report study, those okay, after we get the results, can we go in for like intimate reach, what proportions of it's much difference on. Do we have to plan and finally that we are like going to use these?
After study, can we do a base?
No, this is a Bayesian is a kind of analysis. Only if you do so the analysis is decided only in adaptive designs, a priori.
Okay.
But in any analysis, you have the right to use many methods of doing the analysis. So say for
Okay.
example, when do I use Bayesian analysis? Supposing I get a p-value of 0.08, I get upset it is not statistically significant according to the frequentist approach. But I do the Bayesian analysis immediately by fetching some prior information, mix it with your data, and generate this Bayesian curve, the distribution, and do sensitivity analysis, and present what percentage of subject had 10% difference, 20% difference, and so on. Present this data and say this is very important, study.
So that means that it is okay, even if we are not receiving the protocol, that this kind of analysis we can do. That's what you're saying.
Doing the study that we are going to.
Yeah, you can no harm in writing it in the protocol as a priori method. So it will be useful. The only thing is that the reviewer or the journal should have somebody who knows about posterior Bayesian analysis and so on. Otherwise, they may not be able to encourage the differences what we are showing and the probabilities, etc.
Thank you very much.
Actually, we do have a recording of these on a YouTube channel. It is CEU CMC Vellore. It's a YouTube channel. In another 2 days, this video will go online. Last week's talk is already online on the channel. So for those who would like to see these videos later on, we are uploading that. It's the YouTube channel is CEU CMC Vellore. Once again, let's give Dr. Namrata a big hand. One more big hand to Professor Jayasheelan. He taught us all this. Thank you, sir. Very grateful for you for staying back today and for teaching our STAR students as well. With that, we'll come to an end of today's program. Thank you all very much.